Imagine waking up tomorrow to find your city in ruins, your home reduced to rubble, and your future dictated not by your choices, but by the ambitions of distant leaders. This is not the story of strangers in faraway lands. It is the reality millions are living right now. And it is the reason we must confront the world's most pressing political conflicts together. A child walking through a street scarred by war, clutching a school bag that has outlived its books, is not an image from the past. It is the present reality for millions. Families who never signed treaties, who never sat in government chambers, and who never cast a vote for war are being displaced daily, their lives uprooted by forces far beyond their control. Nations once bound together by shared identities and communities are fracturing, not because people have changed, but because political ambition and ideology have redrawn the lines that separate them. This is the human face of conflict, and it is not confined to one region or one people. It is the silent cry echoing from every corner of the globe, where power struggles overshadow the lives of ordinary citizens. We often think of conflict as something distant, something unfolding on television screens or buried in news articles, but the truth is that it surrounds us more closely than we are willing to admit. A divided family in one part of the world creates ripple effects in another through migration, economic instability, and shifts in global alliances. What appears to be a local crisis quickly becomes international when economies shake, borders tighten, and trust between nations erodes. This interconnectedness makes every political conflict not just someone else's story, but part of a global narrative that we are all inevitably woven into. When we talk about political conflict, the first images that come to mind are usually soldiers, weapons, and battlegrounds. Yet modern conflicts are increasingly fought in boardrooms, parliaments, and digital spaces as much as in the streets. Propaganda shapes public opinion, misinformation fuels division, and polarization tears apart the fabric of societies from within. The battlefield has expanded into the minds of citizens, where loyalty and ideology can be weaponized more effectively than bullets. This reality makes political conflict more insidious because its scars are not always visible. They live in mistrust, in fear, and in the inability of communities to heal long after the fighting subsides. At the heart of these conflicts lies a profound truth. Political disputes are not abstract. They are lived every day in the faces of children who cannot go to school, in the voices of parents who cannot promise safety, and in the weary steps of refugees crossing borders with nothing but hope. Each war, each political standoff, each act of repression represents not only a clash of leaders, but also the breaking of lives at the grassroots. It is easy for global audiences to view them as headlines scrolling across screens, but behind those headlines are millions of quiet tragedies that rarely receive attention. The world has grown accustomed to seeing conflict as perpetual, almost inevitable. But it is important to remember that every crisis we witness today is a product of human choices made by leaders, governments, and institutions. These choices, often driven by pride, power, or greed, set in motion events that cascade into the lives of ordinary people who had no say in the matter. This disconnect between the decision makers and the people who suffer their decisions forms the essence of political conflict. It is this gap that widens divides, breeds resentment, and perpetuates cycles of violence across generations. The conflict between Ukraine and Russia stands as one of the most defining struggles of the modern era, not only because of its immediate devastation, but because of what it represents for the future of international order. What began as a territorial dispute quickly escalated into a war that has shaken Europe and sent tremors across the globe. At its core lies a battle between sovereignty and superpower ambition, a clash of principles that tests whether a nation has the right to determine its own destiny in the face of overwhelming pressure from a larger and more powerful neighbor. For Ukraine, this is about survival, identity, and the preservation of independence won after decades of foreign domination. For Russia, it is about influence, control, and the reassertion of geopolitical power in a world it believes has marginalized its role. The consequences of this war extend far beyond the borders of the two nations directly involved. Energy prices have soared, food supplies have been disrupted, and entire economies have felt the strain. Ukraine has long been a key exporter of grains and agricultural products, and its disruption has sent ripple effects into regions as distant as Africa and the Middle East, where food insecurity has grown more severe. Similarly, Europe's reliance on Russian energy has forced nations to scramble for alternatives. reshaping alliances and pushing the continent to reconsider its energy security in ways not seen since the Cold War. What might appear as a regional conflict has thus transformed into a global crisis, drawing in countries and organizations that cannot afford to remain on the sidelines. On the battlefield itself, the human cost is staggering. Cities have been reduced to rubble, families torn apart, and millions displaced in search of safety. The resilience of the Ukrainian people has become a symbol of resistance, showing the world that even in the face of overwhelming force, the human spirit can stand unbroken. Yet resilience alone cannot erase the trauma, nor can it bring back the countless lives lost in the crossfire of politics and war. For Russia, the war has brought both military and political challenges, straining its resources, isolating it diplomatically, and forcing its citizens to confront the weight of decisions made far above their voices. Beyond the immediate devastation, the conflict represents a larger test for the international community. If one nation can seize the territory of another with limited consequences, then the very principle of sovereignty, an idea that has underpinned international relations for centuries, becomes fragile. Smaller nations watching closely wonder whether their independence can be preserved if global powers are unwilling to uphold these principles. Larger nations, meanwhile, calculate their own interests, balancing moral outrage with economic realities, often revealing the uncomfortable truth that ideals are too often sacrificed for convenience. At the heart of the Ukraine-Russia conflict is the question of whether rules, treaties, and international law still hold weight in an age where might seems to outweigh right. It forces the world to confront whether the future will be defined by cooperation and respect for sovereignty, or by the return of an era where power alone dictates who survives and who does not. The tension between China and Taiwan has become one of the most volatile and closely watched political conflicts in the world, not simply because it concerns two territories, but because it embodies a struggle that could reshape the balance of global power. Taiwan, with its vibrant democracy and self-ruled government, stands as a stark contrast to the one-party system that governs mainland China. To Beijing, Taiwan is not a separate nation, but a breakaway province that must sooner or later be brought under its control. To the people of Taiwan, independence is not merely a political status, but a lived reality, a reflection of their values, culture, and democratic freedoms. This clash of visions lies at the core of the conflict, turning what might otherwise be a regional dispute into a potential flashpoint for global confrontation. The stakes stretch far beyond the island itself. Taiwan holds a critical place in the global economy, particularly in the semiconductor industry, where it produces the vast majority of the world's advanced microchips. These chips power everything from smartphones and medical devices to cars and military equipment. Any disruption to Taiwan's stability would therefore send shockwaves through global supply chains, affecting industries and economies across continents. For China, control of Taiwan would not only fulfill a nationalistic aspiration, but would also provide leverage over one of the most important technologies driving the modern age. For the rest of the world, protecting Taiwan is as much about safeguarding economic security as it is about defending democratic principles. The military dimension of this standoff cannot be ignored. China has invested heavily in building one of the most powerful armed forces in the world, conducting frequent military exercises near Taiwan and sending aircraft into its air defense identification zone as a show of force. These maneuvers are designed not only to intimidate Taiwan, but also to signal to the international community that China's patience is finite. Taiwan, in turn, has strengthened its own defenses while relying heavily on support from allies, particularly the United States, which maintains a delicate but firm commitment to Taiwan's security. The risk of miscalculation is ever present, with even a minor incident having the potential to escalate into a broader conflict that could draw in multiple nations. Diplomatically, the situation is equally complex. Few countries officially recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation due to pressure from Beijing, yet many maintain unofficial ties and continue to support its participation in global organizations. This delicate balancing act reveals the uncomfortable position many governments face, acknowledging China's growing influence while also recognizing Taiwan's democratic legitimacy. Every diplomatic gesture, every trade deal, And every military exercise becomes part of a larger chessboard where the players are acutely aware that one wrong move could ignite a crisis with global consequences. At its core, the China-Taiwan conflict is not only about independence versus reunification, but also about the future of governance and the resilience of democracy in the face of authoritarian resolve. It is about whether smaller nations can maintain their identity and sovereignty when confronted by larger powers determined to shape the world in their image. It is a question that will shape the Pacific region and ripple across every ocean, influencing the trajectory of global politics for decades to come. The war in Sudan is a tragedy that underscores how fragile political structures can be and how quickly the hopes of a people can be crushed under the weight of rival ambitions. For years, Sudan was seen as a nation on the cusp of transformation, emerging from decades of dictatorship with a chance to embrace a new democratic path. Yet instead of unity and progress, it has been dragged into a devastating civil war. A conflict driven not by the will of the people, but by the egos and rivalries of two generals who see power as a prize rather than a responsibility. This struggle for dominance between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces has turned cities into battlegrounds and entire communities into wastelands, leaving millions to suffer consequences they never chose. The human cost of this conflict is staggering. Families have been forced to flee their homes, walking miles without food, water, or shelter. Refugee camps in neighboring countries are swelling with desperate faces, while those who remain inside Sudan are caught in the crossfire of relentless violence. Hospitals are destroyed or overwhelmed, humanitarian aid is blocked or looted, and basic necessities like medicine and clean water have become luxuries. The result is a crisis that is not only political, but profoundly humanitarian, one where famine and disease are as deadly as bullets. Children who should be in school are instead learning the language of survival, and parents who should be providing stability are forced into impossible choices just to keep their families alive. International attention, fleeting at best, has failed to keep pace with the scale of the devastation. Unlike conflicts in other parts of the world that dominate headlines, Sudan's suffering often lingers in the shadows of global awareness. This neglect reveals an uncomfortable truth: not all wars are treated equally. The voices of Sudan's civilians struggle to break through the noise of geopolitics, and the lack of sustained international focus allows the conflict to continue with little accountability for those responsible. Injustice thrives when the world looks away, and Sudan is a grim example of how forgotten wars can fester endlessly. The war also speaks to the broader challenge facing Africa as a continent. Sudan is not alone in its struggles with power, hungry leaders, fragile governments, and weak institutions. Its collapse into violence serves as both a warning and a mirror, reflecting the dangers that arise when nations fail to build inclusive political systems capable of handling disputes peacefully. Regional neighbors are forced to absorb the consequences, from waves of refugees crossing borders to economic disruptions that destabilize already fragile economies. The ripple effects ensure that Sudan's crisis is not just Sudan's burden, but a regional and ultimately a global concern. At the heart of it all lies a sobering reality: ordinary Sudanese people remain trapped in a war they did not ask for, their lives torn apart by leaders who put personal power above national unity. The suffering of Sudan is a stark reminder that political conflict, no matter how local it may seem, always carries consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. The political divide within the United States has become one of the most pressing conflicts of our time, not because it mirrors traditional warfare, but because it strikes at the heart of democracy itself. Unlike conflicts marked by tanks and missiles, this is a struggle of ballots, narratives, and ideologies that pit citizens against one another in ways that feel as destructive as any battlefield. The United States has long been held up as a symbol of democratic resilience, a nation that not only preached unity and freedom, but served as a model for others striving toward the same ideals. Yet today, the very system once admired for its stability appears fragile, shaken by deep polarization that turns neighbors into opponents and political debates into existential battles. This conflict is not defined by physical borders, but by ideological lines that cut through every community. Families find themselves divided at dinner tables, friendships fracture under the weight of opposing views, and workplaces often become microcosms of a broader national tension. The intensity of partisanship has reached a point where compromise is seen as weakness. where loyalty to party often outweighs loyalty to shared national identity. This erosion of trust has left citizens doubting institutions that once seemed unshackable. Congress, the judiciary, the media, and even the electoral system itself. When people begin to question whether their votes matter, whether courts are impartial, or whether leaders represent the collective good, democracy loses the very foundation on which it stands. The roots of this polarization are complex, stemming from economic inequality, racial tensions, cultural divides, and the rapid transformation of information in the digital age. Social media has amplified divisions, creating echo chambers where individuals consume only the voices that reinforce their beliefs while demonizing those who disagree. Political leaders often exploit these divides rather than heal them, turning legitimate concerns into weapons for political gain. The result is a society where mistrust grows stronger than dialogue, where anger becomes easier to cultivate than understanding, and where cooperation feels nearly impossible. The consequences of this internal conflict stretch far beyond America's borders. The world has long looked to the United States as a stabilizing force, a nation capable of projecting not only power but also moral leadership. When the United States appears fractured, the global order trembles. Allies begin to question its reliability, adversaries exploit its divisions, and the very idea of democracy as a model for governance weakens in the eyes of the international community. The internal battles of America are thus not confined to its own citizens. They ripple outward, shaping how nations engage with one another and redefining the balance of influence in the world. At the center of this struggle lies a profound question: can democracy survive when division runs deeper than unity, when ideology eclipses identity, and when truth itself becomes a matter of opinion? The conflict within the United States is not a distant possibility, but a present reality, one that challenges the resilience of its people and tests whether the world's oldest modern democracy can withstand the weight of its own contradictions. These conflicts are not simply political struggles unfolding on a chessboard of power. They are deeply human stories etched into the lives of millions. Every decision made in a palace, parliament, or presidential office trickles down into the homes of ordinary people who bear the heaviest weight of choices they never had a hand in making. To see them only as geopolitical maneuvers is to miss the heart of what conflict truly is: a relentless breaking of human lives, of families, of communities. Behind the statistics and headlines are children who cannot sleep without the sound of gunfire, parents who sacrifice everything just to secure a meal, and entire generations that inherit not opportunity, but trauma. When political leaders clash, it is never just their nations that collide, it is humanity itself that bleeds. These wars and tensions do not stay contained within borders. They spill into the global economy, disrupt food supplies, alter energy flows, and reshape the very fabric of international trust. A war in one region can raise the cost of bread in another, push waves of refugees across oceans, or inspire acts of extremism continents away. The world is more interconnected than ever before, and that means no conflict is truly local. When Ukraine struggles for sovereignty, it affects Europe's security, Africa's food supply, and America's foreign policy. When Taiwan faces threats, technology markets tremble and alliances in the Pacific are recalibrated. When Sudan burns, neighboring countries strain under refugee crisis and the international community is forced to confront its selective silence. Each conflict radiates outward like ripples on water, ensuring that even those far from the battlefield are touched by its consequences. Yet amid these tragedies lies resilience that cannot be ignored. Communities continue to resist, citizens cling to hope, and ordinary people perform extraordinary acts of courage simply to survive another day. It is this resilience that shows us why these conflicts cannot be dismissed as someone else's problem. They are a reminder that despite devastation, the human spirit endures, demanding recognition, dignity, and justice. But resilience alone should not be mistaken for a solution. It should be a call to action. The endurance of people under such immense suffering highlights the failure of global systems that were designed to prevent these tragedies, but too often respond with hesitation, indifference, or self-interest. To treat conflict as spectacle is to allow injustice to thrive. Watching wars unfold through headlines and broadcasts without engaging in solutions reduces human suffering to entertainment, leaving the world desensitized to pain. These conflicts demand more than passive observation. They demand responsibility. Nations cannot afford to look away, for to ignore suffering elsewhere is to invite instability everywhere. The challenge, then, is not simply to understand these conflicts, but to respond to them with empathy, urgency, and a recognition that peace is never just a regional matter. Peace anywhere strengthens stability everywhere, and failure to act allows wounds to fester until they spill across borders and generations. Each of these conflicts may appear on the surface to be about land, politics, or ideology, but beneath them lies something far more universal, the story of human suffering and resilience. They are not abstract games of strategy played by leaders on the world stage, but lived realities that tear at the fabric of everyday existence. In Ukraine, the struggle for sovereignty is not merely a geopolitical clash, but a matter of survival for families huddled in bomb shelters, hoping their homes will still stand tomorrow. In Gaza and Israel, generations grow up knowing more about checkpoints and explosions than about peace, carrying the trauma of cycles of violence into adulthood. In Taiwan, the anxiety of living under the shadow of a superpower threat is woven into daily life, reminding its people that their democratic freedoms are constantly under siege. In Sudan, parents face the unbearable task of choosing between starvation at home or the dangers of fleeing across borders. And in America, the fracture of trust between citizens has created invisible wounds, leaving neighbors estranged and democracy itself under pressure. What these conflicts reveal is that the world is bound together not only by trade treaties and technology, but by shared vulnerabilities. When one nation suffers, the consequences rarely stop at its borders. Refugees cross into neighboring states, food shortages disrupt distant markets, energy crises ripple into households thousands of miles away, and global alliances are tested or reshaped under the strain. The interconnectedness of today's world ensures that no conflict is isolated, and every outbreak of violence or instability creates aftershocks that affect the collective global order. This reality transforms these crises from being someone else's tragedy into a shared responsibility. To dismiss these conflicts as distant problems is to misunderstand the nature of modern power and interdependence. Globalization has created a world where the well-being of one region is tied to the stability of another, meaning the unraveling of peace anywhere weakens security everywhere. A child displaced in Sudan is not only a humanitarian concern, but part of a migration crisis that reshapes entire regions. A factory shut down in Taiwan because of rising tensions reverberates in the prices of goods on shelves in Europe and America. A divided political landscape in the United States influences the credibility of democracy as a model, emboldening authoritarian regimes in their own pursuits. Each event bleeds into another, creating a tapestry of consequences that remind us that human suffering anywhere is relevant everywhere. What binds all these conflicts together is their capacity to expose the limits of international systems meant to protect peace. Institutions built after world wars to uphold sovereignty, human rights, and cooperation often appear paralyzed or selective in their action, undermining faith in the very principles they claim to defend. For those living under the shadow of these conflicts, the question is not about which superpower wins or loses, but whether their children will see a tomorrow worth living for. The pain of these people is not confined to their own borders. It belongs to all of us, because in their struggles we see reflected our own fragility, our own dependence on peace, and our own responsibility to protect it. The conclusion drawn from examining these conflicts is not about predicting winners or losers, but about confronting the choice that stands before humanity as a whole. Each conflict illustrates a pattern where human lives are reduced to collateral damage while power struggles dominate the narrative. The recurring lesson is clear. Wars and political standoffs do not remain confined within the borders where they begin. They shape economies, transform alliances, and alter the trajectory of global peace. The question the world must ask itself is whether it will continue to act as a passive observer or finally accept the responsibility that comes with being part of an interconnected global community. Remaining on the sidelines is not neutrality, it is complicity in allowing suffering to persist unchallenged. When a nation bleeds, the effects spill into the wider world. Refugees cross into new lands seeking shelter, straining resources and reshaping demographics. Global markets falter, food prices climb, and energy shortages push entire societies into crisis. Extremist ideologies feed on instability, finding fertile ground in desperation. what might appear as a localized conflict soon becomes a global issue, pulling other nations into its orbit, whether they wish it or not. This reality means that no nation has the luxury of indifference. To ignore conflict is to invite it closer, to allow its consequences to seep slowly into one's own borders until action becomes unavoidable. The responsibility, then, is not only for leaders but for societies at large. Citizens must demand more than empty rhetoric from their governments, more than symbolic gestures that do little to alleviate suffering. They must insist on real diplomacy, on accountability for those who wage war, and on sustained efforts to address the humanitarian crisis that follow in conflict's wake. This is not simply about politics, but about morality, about recognizing the shared humanity that binds people across borders. Empathy must not end at the water's edge, because every displaced family, every destroyed home, every silenced voice represents a failure of collective will to defend the dignity of human life. The path forward is not easy. It requires nations to put aside short-term interests in favor of long-term stability, to see beyond alliances based solely on convenience, and to confront uncomfortable truths about selective intervention. The world has shown it is capable of unity when crises feel immediate, but the challenge is to extend that urgency to conflicts that may not appear on the doorstep, but that inevitably affect everyone in time. Peace requires effort, persistence, and above all, the courage to act before suffering grows beyond repair. These conflicts are not distant tragedies to be pitied and forgotten. They are tests of whether humanity is willing to rise above indifference. The future will be shaped not only by those who seek power through violence, but by those who dare to answer the question of whether we will remain silent spectators or take the harder path of responsibility, action, and solidarity. In the end, these conflicts are not just about nations and power. They are about people, about lives interrupted and futures stolen. The question before us is simple: will we watch from a distance, or will we rise to the responsibility of shaping a world where peace is stronger than politics?